The bright lights of the press conference room made everything look harsh and unforgiving. Kim Tae-in sat behind the long table, his usually perfect hair slightly messy from running his hands through it nervously. As one of Korea's biggest drama stars, he had done thousands of interviews, but today felt different. The weight of what he was about to say pressed down on his chest like a heavy stone. The reporter asking questions was young, probably fresh out of journalism school. She had been asking simple questions about his new historical drama Palace of Dreams when she mentioned something that made his blood run cold. Your character plays a loyal royal guard who never betrayed his king. Do you think Korean guards were really that honorable during difficult times in history? Tae-hyun's mind flashed back to his grandmother's deathbed confession 3 months ago. Her wrinkled hands had gripped his tightly as she whispered secrets that had been buried for 70 years. Secrets about his great-grandfather who had served in the royal palace. Secrets that would destroy the image of heroic guards that everyone believed in. Honorable, Tae-hyun repeated slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. The room went completely quiet. Even the camera operators stopped moving. Let me tell you what real honor looked like during the Japanese occupation. His manager, sitting in the corner, started making frantic hand signals for him to stop. But Tae-hyun was past caring about his career or his image. The truth had been eating at him for months, and he could not pretend anymore. My great-grandfather was a royal guard, he continued, his voice getting stronger, but he was not the hero you see in dramas. When the Japanese took over, they gave Korean guards a choice: to work with us and keep your family safe, or refuse and watch them suffer. What would you choose? The reporters started whispering among themselves. Some were already typing frantically on their phones. Tae-hyun saw his manager's face turn white with panic, but he could not stop now. The guards who survived were not the most loyal ones. They were the smartest ones. The ones who knew how to play both sides. My great-grandfather gave information to the Japanese during the day and helped Korean resistance fighters at night. He saved more lives by being flexible than he ever could have by being purely loyal to one side. A reporter in the front row raised her hand quickly. Are you saying Korean historical heroes were actually collaborators? Tae-hyun felt his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. I am saying that real life is more complicated than the stories we tell ourselves. Heroes and villains are easy to understand, but real people had to make impossible choices just to survive. The room exploded into chaos. Cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters shouted questions over each other. His manager jumped up and tried to end the press conference, but it was too late. The damage was done. Within an hour, video clips of his statement were everywhere online. Social media exploded with anger and confusion. Korean netizens, who had loved him just that morning, were now calling him a traitor to his own country. The hashtag Tae-hyun traitor started trending immediately. His phone buzzed nonstop with calls from his agency, his co-stars and journalists wanting more details. He turned it off and sat alone in his car outside the press conference building. Watching people walk by on the busy Seoul street, none of them knew that their beloved drama star had just destroyed his career by telling the truth. That evening, Tae-hyun sat in his expensive apartment staring at the old photo his grandmother had given him before she died. It showed his great-grandfather in his royal guard uniform, looking serious and tired. Next to him stood a Japanese officer, and they were shaking hands. For 70 years, his family had hidden this photo and the story that came with it. His sister Ji-yoon arrived with bags of his favorite food, but he could not eat anything. She had been crying, her makeup smeared, and her usually neat appearance disheveled. The whole country is angry at you, she said quietly. They are saying you dishonored our ancestors' memory. But what if our ancestors were more complicated than we thought? Tae-hyun asked, still staring at the photograph. What if the real dishonor is pretending they were perfect when they were just human beings trying to survive? Outside his apartment building, protesters had already gathered, carried signs with his photo crossed out in red.
Us.
Some were burning posters from his dramas. The man who had been Korea's sweetheart for 5 years was now its most hated celebrity. All because he had told a truth that people were not ready to hear. His management company released a statement that night, trying to distance themselves from his comments. Kim Tae-hyun's personal opinions do not represent the views of our agency, it read. We are reviewing his contracts and considering appropriate actions. Television networks started pulling his drama reruns from their schedules. Advertisers who had paid millions for his endorsements began canceling their contracts. By midnight, it was clear that his career as Korea's leading man was over. But as he looked at his great-grandfather's photo one more time before going to bed, Tae-hyun felt something he had not expected. Relief. After months of carrying this secret, the truth was finally out in the world, even if the world did not want to accept it. The next morning brought newspapers with headlines that made Tae-hyun's stomach hurt. Drama star betrays Korean heroes screamed across the front page of every major publication. His face was everywhere, but now it represented shame instead of pride. Coffee shops that had once displayed his photos as decoration were taking them down. Fan clubs were announcing they were disbanding at Seoul National University. Professor Lee Mung-suk was preparing for her morning history lecture when a student showed her the news on his phone. As one of Korea's most respected experts on the Japanese occupation period, she had spent decades researching what really happened during those dark years. Her eyes widened as she read Tae-hyun's exact words. This is remarkable, she whispered to herself, adjusting her thick glasses. 4:30. Years, she had been finding evidence in archives and family records that supported exactly what the young actor had said. But academic papers did not reach ordinary people the way celebrity statements did. During her lecture that morning, Professor Lee made a decision that would change everything. Standing in front of 200 students, she put aside her planned lesson about ancient Korean kingdoms and instead talked about Tae-hyun's press conference. What this young man said yesterday takes incredible courage, she told her surprised students. I have spent my entire career studying this period, and the truth is exactly as complicated as he described. Royal guards, palace workers, government officials, they all faced impossible choices. Some collaborated to protect their families, others resisted and died. Many did both, switching sides when they had to. A student in the back row raised her hand nervously. But Professor, does that mean everything we learned in school about Korean heroes is wrong? Professor Lee smiled sadly. It means that real heroes are more interesting than the simple stories we tell about them, your great-grandfathers. We're not perfect, but they were human. And being human while surviving impossible circumstances is its own kind of heroism. Meanwhile, at the KBS television network, executives were having emergency meetings about what to do with Tae-hyun's current drama, Palace of Dreams. The show was their biggest hit in 3 years, bringing in massive advertising revenue. Sponsors were threatening to pull out if they kept airing episodes featuring the controversial star. Director Park In-ho, who had worked with Tae-hyun for 2 years, found himself in an impossible position. He knew the actor personally and had always respected his honesty and dedication. But the network was pressuring him to make a public statement condemning Tae-hyun's comments. I will not throw him under the bus, Park told the network executives during a heated meeting. He spoke from his heart about his own family's history. Since when is telling personal truth a crime? But the pressure was enormous. By afternoon, 3 major sponsors had already pulled their advertisements from the show. The network calculated that continuing to support Tae-hyun could cost them hundreds of millions of won in lost revenue. At the same time, something unexpected was happening on social media. While older, more conservative Koreans were expressing outrage at Tae-hyun's statements, younger people were starting to ask different questions. University students began sharing articles about the complexity of the occupation period. Some posted photos of their own family members from that time, along with stories they had heard whispered at family gatherings. A 22-year-old college student named Park Min-ji started a hashtag called #ComplexTruth. She posted a photo of her great-grandmother with a long caption, "My great-grandmother worked in a Japanese household during the occupation. Family members always called her a collaborator and were ashamed of her. But she used her position too. Steal food and medicine for Korean families who were starving. Who was she really, a traitor or a hero?" Within hours, hundreds of young people were sharing similar stories. Each post revealed another layer of complexity that had been hidden. Behind simple stories of good versus evil, the conversation that Taehan had started was growing into something much larger than one actor's controversial statement. But the backlash was growing too. Conservative groups organized protests outside television stations and movie theaters. Elderly citizens who had lived through the occupation themselves felt personally attacked by suggestions that the period was anything other than a clear struggle between Korean patriots and Japanese oppressors. At his apartment, Hyeon watched all of this unfold on the news while eating convenience store food. His refrigerator, usually stocked by his assistant with expensive organic meals, was nearly empty. His assistant had quit that morning, afraid to be associated with the scandal. His phone finally rang with a call he decided to answer. It was Kim Soo-jin, his co-star from Palace of Dreams. They had worked together for 8 months and had become close friends. "I believe you," she said simply when he answered. "My grandfather never talked about the war years, but sometimes late at night, I would hear him crying in his room. Something happened during that time that he could never forgive himself for. Your story makes me think that maybe he was not a villain, just a man caught in an impossible situation." For the first time since the press conference, Taehoon felt like he was not completely alone. One person believed him. One person understood that he had not been trying to hurt anyone, just trying to honor his great-grandfather's real story instead of a fake heroic version. That night, as protesters continued their vigil outside his building, Taehyun made a decision. He would not apologize for telling the truth. Even if it cost him everything, he would stand by his great-grandfather's memory and the complicated reality of what survival had required during the darkest period in Korean history. 3 days after the press conference, investigative journalist Han So-young was digging through old records in the National Archives basement. Known for her fearless reporting on government corruption and historical cover-ups, she had been following the Taehyun controversy with professional interest. Something about his specific details suggested he was not just making things up for attention. The dusty files she was examining contained employment records from the royal palace during the 1940s. Most researchers avoided these documents because they were incomplete and difficult to read. But So-young had learned that the most interesting truths were often hidden in the most boring paperwork. "This is impossible," she muttered to herself, staring at a faded document. According to the official records, dozens of palace guards had been relocated for administrative purposes during key periods of the occupation. But when she cross-referenced these relocations with resistance activities in other parts of the country, a pattern emerged. The guards who had been relocated often ended up in areas where underground resistance movements were most active. Either this was the biggest coincidence in Korean history, or someone had been running a secret operation using palace guards as double agents. Her assistant, a young man named Jung Woo-jin, looked over her shoulder at the documents. "Are you thinking?" "What I am thinking," he asked quietly. "I am thinking that Kim Taehyun might have just exposed the most successful intelligence operation in Korean history." So-young replied, "And nobody wanted to admit it existed because it required collaboration with the enemy." Meanwhile, at his apartment, Taehyun was dealing with a different kind of investigation. His management company had sent lawyers to discuss his contract violations and potential lawsuits. The head of legal affairs, a stern woman in her 50s, sat across from him with a stack of papers. "You have cost the company over 50 million. Won and lost endorsement deals," she said coldly. "The standard contract includes clauses about maintaining a positive public image. Your statements clearly violated those clauses." Taehyun looked at the lawyers and felt nothing but emptiness. 3 months ago, these same people had been praising him as their most valuable asset. Now they were calculating exactly how much his honesty was going to cost them. "What if I can prove that what I said was true?" he asked. The lawyer laughed harshly. "Truth is not the issue here. The issue is profit. Your truth is costing us money." But truth was becoming an issue in other places. Professor Lee Mung-suk had been contacted by colleagues from universities across Asia who were interested in Taehyun's claims. A historian from Tokyo had sent her copies of Japanese military documents that mentioned Korean palace guards providing Information during the occupation? This is extraordinary, she told her research assistant while examining the Japanese documents. These records show that Korean guards were not just randomly collaborating. Someone was coordinating their activities. It was an organized resistance operation, disguised as collaboration. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Korean guards would provide the Japanese with accurate but useless information about palace activities while secretly documenting Japanese military movements and plans. The information they gathered had been passed to resistance fighters who used it to avoid capture and plan attacks. At the same time, families across Korea were opening old boxes and dusty photo albums. Taehyun's story had given them permission to examine their own complicated family histories. A grandmother in Busan found letters her husband had hidden for 60 years. A man in Daegu discovered photos of his father wearing both Korean traditional clothes and Japanese military uniforms. Each discovery added another piece to a puzzle that was much larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. The occupation had not been a simple story of Korean victims and Japanese oppressors. It had been a complicated web of survival, resistance, collaboration, and sacrifice that defied easy categorization. Social media reflected this growing complexity. The hashtag complex truth continued to trend as more young people shared their family stories. But there was also increasing backlash from people who felt that complicating the historical narrative was unpatriotic and dangerous. A famous conservative commentator went on television to denounce what he called the relativization of Korean suffering. He argued that accepting complexity was the same as excusing Japanese crimes and dishonoring Korean sacrifices. Some truths are too dangerous to discuss publicly, he declared. Social stability requires clear heroes and villains. When we start saying that collaborators were actually resistors, we undermine the moral foundation of our entire society. Professor Lee disagreed. That evening, she appeared on a television debate show to respond to the commentator's arguments. Sitting across from him in the bright studio, she looked calm and determined. Hiding complexity does not honor our ancestors, she said firmly. It diminishes them. Real people who faced impossible choices and found creative ways to survive and resist deserve more respect than cartoon heroes who never existed. The debate became heated quickly. The commentator accused her of being unpatriotic and of encouraging young people to disrespect Korean history. She accused him of preferring comfortable lies to difficult truths. But the most powerful moment came when a viewer called in to the show. It was an elderly man whose voice shook with emotion as he spoke. My father was a palace guard during those years, the caller said. He never talked about what happened, but every year on the anniversary of Korea's liberation, would lock himself in his room and cry. I spent my whole life thinking he was ashamed of something bad he had done. After hearing this discussion, I am wondering if he was actually proud of something good he had done that nobody could ever know about. The studio went completely silent. Even the conservative commentator had no response to the pain and hope in the old man's voice. Across the country, people watching the debate realized that this was not just about one actor's controversial statement anymore. It was about how they understood their own families, their own history, and their own identity as Koreans. A week after the television debate, journalist Han So-young made a discovery that would change everything. Deep in the National Archives, she found a file that had been misfiled for decades. It contained correspondence between Korean palace officials and what appeared to be resistance leaders, all written in a code that took her 3 days to decipher with help from cryptography experts. The letters revealed the existence of something called the Silent Guard, a network of palace workers who had been feeding information to resistance movements while appearing to collaborate with Japanese forces. The operation had been so secret that even most resistance fighters did not know the guards were working for them. This is incredible, So-young told her editor as she spread copies of the decoded letters across his desk. Taehyun was not just telling his family's story, he was describing one of the most successful intelligence operations in Korean history. Her editor, a cautious man who had seen many promising stories fall apart, studied the documents carefully.
You sure these
are authentic? If we publish this and it turns out to be fake, we will both lose our jobs. So-young had already thought about that. She had spent days verifying the paper, ink, and handwriting with forensic experts. She had cross-referenced names and dates with other historical records. Everything checked out, but she knew that would not be enough for critics who preferred simple historical narratives. Meanwhile, Taehaen was facing pressure from an unexpected source. His own family was split about his decision to go public with their great-grandfather's story. His uncle, a successful businessman who had built his reputation on being from a family of Korean patriots, was furious. "You've embarrassed our entire family," his uncle shouted during a heated confrontation at the family home. "Do you know what my business partners are saying about me now? They think we come from a family of collaborators?" Taehaen's aunt tried to mediate, but she was also concerned about the family's reputation. "Could you not have kept this private?" she asked sadly. "Some truths do not need to be shared with the whole world." But Taehaen's elderly grandfather, who had been quiet during the argument, finally spoke up. At 91 years old, he was the only person in the room who had actually known his father personally. "My father came home different after the war," the old man said slowly. "He would wake up at night talking in his sleep about people whose names I did not recognize. He kept a small notebook hidden in his room, but he never let anyone see what was in it. When he died, he made me promise to burn it without reading it." The room went silent. Taehaen stared at his grandfather in shock. "You burned evidence of what really happened?" His grandfather nodded sadly. He was so afraid that someone would misunderstand what he had done. "He made me swear that the family would never know the details. But now I am wondering if I made a mistake. Maybe the world was not ready for the truth then, but maybe it is ready now." At Seoul National University, Professor Lee was dealing with her own family pressure. The university administration had received numerous complaints about her support for Taehaen's statements. Conservative alumni were threatening to withdraw donations. If she continued to defend what they saw as anti-Korean propaganda, the university president called her into his office for what he euphemistically called a friendly discussion about her recent media appearances. "I am not asking you to change your research or your opinions," he said carefully. "But perhaps you could be more diplomatic about how you express them publicly. The university depends on public support, and controversy can affect our funding." "Professor." Lee looked at the man who had been her colleague for 15 years and felt disappointed but not surprised. Academic freedom was always conditional on not upsetting the wrong people. "If I cannot discuss my research publicly, then what is the point of doing research?" she asked. "Are we scholars seeking truth, or are we entertainers telling people what they want to hear?" The president did not have a good answer for that question. But support for complexity was coming from unexpected places. At Yonsei University, a group of graduate students in history had formed what they called the Truth Seekers Society. They began organizing symposiums where elderly Koreans could share their family stories without fear of judgment. The first meeting was held in a small lecture hall. The organizers expected maybe 20 people to attend. Instead, over 200 people showed up, many of them elderly citizens carrying old photographs and documents they had never shared publicly. One by one, they told stories that painted a picture of the occupation period that was far more complex than official histories acknowledged. A woman shared letters from her grandmother, who had worked as a translator for Japanese officials, while secretly passing information to resistance fighters. A man brought photographs of his grandfather in both Korean traditional dress and Japanese military uniform, explaining that the old man had infiltrated Japanese units to gather intelligence. Each story was different. They all shared a common theme. Survival during impossible times had required moral flexibility that later generations found difficult to understand or accept. The symposium was filmed and posted online, where it quickly went viral. Suddenly, Taehaen was not the only person talking about historical complexity. Hundreds of families were coming forward with their own complicated stories, but this only intensified the backlash from people who saw the growing movement as a threat to national unity. Conservative groups organized counter-protests, and some politicians began calling for investigations into what they termed historical revisionism and unpatriotic propaganda. The controversy was no longer just about one actor's press conference. It had become a battle for the soul of Korean historical memory, with truth seekers on one side and myth preservers on the other. And somewhere in the middle was Taehyun, the reluctant catalyst who had started it all by simply trying to honor his great-grandfather's real story instead of a comfortable fiction. 2 weeks after the university symposium, journalist Han So-young was ready to publish her investigation. Her article, titled "The Silent Guard: Korea's Hidden Heroes of the Occupation," was scheduled to appear in the weekend edition of Korea's largest newspaper. But on Thursday night, she received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was elderly and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had kept secrets for a very long time. "Hey, my name is Park Chang-soo," the caller said. "I am 87 years old, and I was a member of the Silent Guard that you wrote about in your article." So-young nearly dropped the phone. She had been hoping to find someone who could verify her research, but she had never expected a direct witness to contact her. "I read about your investigation in the preview that was leaked online," Park Chung-soo continued. "You got most of the details right, but there are things you do not know. It's things that only the surviving members know. If you want the complete story, we need to meet." The meeting was arranged for the following evening in a quiet tea house in Insadong. So-young arrived early and waited nervously, wondering if the old man would actually show up. When he walked through the door, she recognized him immediately from his careful posture and sharp eyes. This was someone who had spent a lifetime keeping secrets. Park Chung-soo sat down slowly and studied her face carefully before speaking. "Before I tell you anything," he said, "you need to understand that revealing the full truth will hurt some people. Some of the guards who worked with us had children and grandchildren who grew up believing their fathers were collaborators. Learning that they were actually heroes might be wonderful, but it might also be confusing and painful." So-young assured him that she would handle the information responsibly, but she needed to know the truth for her article to be complete. What Park Chung-soo told her over the next 3 hours was remarkable. The Silent Guard had been much larger and more sophisticated than even her research had suggested. At its peak, the network included over 40 palace workers, government clerks, and even some Japanese officials who had secretly opposed the occupation. "We saved hundreds of resistance fighters by giving them advance warning of raids," he explained. "We provided detailed maps of Japanese military installations. We even helped some prisoners escape by creating false paperwork. We could only do this work by appearing to be loyal servants of the occupying government." The most shocking revelation was that the network had continued operating even after Korea's liberation in 1945. Many of the guards had been so traumatized by having to appear as collaborators that they had never revealed their true role, even to their own families. "We made a pact," Park Chung-soo said sadly. "We agreed to take the secret to our graves rather than risk anyone misunderstanding what we had done. But watching this young actor get destroyed for telling a truth that we had been too cowardly to tell ourselves, ... It made me realize that staying silent was not protecting anyone anymore." Meanwhile, Taehyun was preparing for what might be his final television appearance. A major network had offered him a chance to clarify his statements, but his agency had forbidden him from doing any more interviews. He was contractually obligated to remain silent while they tried to manage the damage to his career. But Taehyun had made his decision. He would break his contract and speak publicly one more time, even if it meant paying millions of won in penalties and facing lawsuits. The truth was more important than his career or his financial security. The interview was scheduled for prime time on Sunday night. News of his appearance had leaked, and social media was buzzing with anticipation. Supporters hoped he would provide more evidence for his claims. Critics expected him to apologize and retreat from his controversial position. At the same time, Professor Lee Mung-suk was facing her own moment of truth. The university had given her an ultimatum: publicly distance herself from the historical revisionism, controversy, or face suspension from her teaching duties. She had until Monday morning to decide. Sitting in her office late Friday night, surrounded by decades of research that supported everything Taehyun had said, she made her choice. She would not abandon the truth to save her job. On Saturday morning, she submitted her resignation letter, along with a detailed statement explaining her position. "I became a historian to seek truth, not to preserve comfortable myths, she wrote. If this university cannot support honest scholarship, then it is not a place where I can continue to work. Her resignation became front-page news and sparked protests from students and faculty who supported academic freedom. The controversy was no longer just about historical interpretation. It had become a symbol of broader struggles between truth, inconvenience, courage, and conformity. By Sunday evening, when Taehan appeared on television for his interview, the entire country was watching. He looked tired but determined as he sat across from the interviewer in the bright studio. "Do you regret speaking out about your great-grandfather?" the interviewer asked. Tae-Haeon thought for a moment before answering. "I regret that it took me so long," he said quietly. "I regret that fear of controversy kept me silent while other families carried similar secrets alone. But I do not regret honoring my great-grandfather's memory by telling his real story instead of a fake heroic version." The interviewer pressed him about the damage to his career and his relationships. Was telling this story worth losing everything? "Have not lost everything," Taehan replied. "I've lost some contracts and some fair-weather friends. But I have gained something more valuable, the respect of people who understand that truth is more important than popularity. And maybe I have given other families permission to stop being ashamed of ancestors who did the best they could under impossible circumstances." As the interview concluded, viewers across Korea realized they were witnessing something historic, not just the end of one man's career, but the beginning of a new conversation about how nations remember their past and what they owe to the complicated truth of human experience. 3 days after Taehan's television interview, Han So-young published her explosive article about the Silent Guard. The story appeared on the front page of the Sunday edition with the headline, "Korea's Secret Heroes, the Palace Guards Who Fooled Everyone." Accompanying the article were photographs that Park Chung-soo had kept hidden for 70 years. Showing coded messages and secret meeting locations, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the newspaper hitting stands, Park Chang-soo's phone was ringing constantly. 3 other surviving members of the Silent Guard contacted him, saying they were ready to tell their stories too. Families across Korea began examining their own hidden documents with new understanding. At the newspaper office, So-young was fielding calls from international media outlets wanting to interview her about the discovery. The story had implications far beyond Korea. Historians around the world were interested in this example of resistance networks, operating under the cover of apparent collaboration, but the most important call came from an unexpected source. Kim Tae-hyun's management company contacted her directly, asking if she would be willing to work with their former client on a documentary about the Silent Guard story. "We made a mistake," the agency representative admitted. "We thought protecting his career was more important than supporting his honesty. But now we see that he was ahead of a much larger story. We want to help him tell it properly." Taehan was hesitant at first. His trust in the entertainment industry had been shattered by how quickly everyone had abandoned him. But when he met with So-young and Park Chung-soo together, he realized this was bigger than his personal vindication. This was about giving voice to heroes who had been forced to remain silent for 7 decades. The documentary project moved forward quickly. Park Chang-soo introduced them to the other surviving Silent Guard members, each of whom had fascinating stories about their covert operations. More importantly, they had maintained detailed records of their activities, including maps, coded messages, photographs that proved the scope of their resistance work. Professor Lee, despite having lost her university position, agreed to serve as historical consultant for the project. Her expertise was crucial in verifying the documents and placing the Silent Guard activities in proper historical context. "This is what historians dream of," she told the documentary crew during filming. "Primary source evidence that changes our understanding of a major historical period." These men were not just surviving, they were actively fighting back in ways that were invisible to both their enemies and their own people. As word spread about the documentary, something remarkable began happening. Elderly Koreans across the country started coming forward with similar stories about their own family members. The Silent Guard had apparently been just one of several covert resistance networks operating within institutions that appeared to be collaborating with the Japanese Former bank employee revealed that his father had used his position to secretly fund resistance activities while appearing to manage Japanese financial interests. A retired teacher shared documents showing how educators had embedded Korean cultural lessons within mandatory Japanese curriculum. Each revelation added another layer to the picture of a sophisticated, hidden resistance movement. The backlash was intense but different now. Instead of attacking Taehan as an unpatriotic troublemaker, critics were forced to engage with documented historical evidence. Some conservative commentators continued to argue that revealing this complexity was dangerous. But their arguments seemed weak against the mounting proof of Korean heroism that had been hidden for decades. 6 months after his controversial press conference, Taehan found himself in a position he had never expected. Instead of being Korea's most hated celebrity, he had become a respected advocate for historical truth. The documentary had won several international awards and was being translated into multiple languages for distribution worldwide. More importantly, his courage in speaking out had created space for hundreds of other families to reclaim their ancestors' true legacy. The man whose great-grandfather had been whispered about as a shameful collaborator was now recognized as part of Korea's most sophisticated resistance operation. At the documentary's premiere in Seoul, Taehan stood on stage looking out at an audience that included Park Chung-soo and the other surviving Silent Guard members. Professor Lee, journalist Han So-young, and hundreds of family members who had discovered their own hidden heroes through the investigation his confession had sparked. 6 months ago, I thought I was destroying my career by telling one family's secret, he said during his speech. Instead, I learned that our secret was shared by hundreds of families who had been carrying shame that should have been pride. My great-grandfather was not a collaborator who survived by betraying his principles. He was a hero who saved lives by being brave enough to appear as something he was not. The audience gave him a standing ovation, but the most meaningful moment came when Park Chung-soo slowly stood up and saluted him. The 87-year-old veteran, who had spent 7 decades keeping secrets, was finally able to honor a fellow guardian of hidden truth. After the premiere, Taehan received offers from major film studios wanting to hire him for historical dramas, but these were different from his previous roles. Directors wanted to work with him because of his commitment to authenticity and complexity. It's not because of his pretty face or romantic appeal. His first new project was a film about the Silent Guard, with Park Chung-soo serving as technical advisor. The old man spent hours on set, teaching the actors how to use the coded communication methods and explaining the psychological toll of living double lives for years. The hardest part was not the danger, Park Chung-soo explained to Taehan during filming. It was coming home to your family every night and letting them believe you were something you were not. Some of the guards' wives died thinking their husbands were traitors. Their children grew up ashamed of fathers who were actually heroes. This revelation led to another unexpected development. Genealogy researchers began helping families trace their ancestors' true activities during the occupation period. Government archives that had been closed for decades were reopened for public research. The Ministry of Education announced plans to revise history textbooks to include more nuanced discussions of resistance and survival during wartime. Professor Lee was offered positions at 3 different universities, all of whom wanted to hire the scholar who had supported historical truth over institutional convenience. She chose to accept a position at a small but prestigious research institute, where she could focus entirely on uncovering hidden aspects of Korean history. Han So-young won the country's highest journalism award for her investigation of the Silent Guard, but more importantly to her, she had sparked a movement of investigative reporters who were digging deeper into other aspects of Korean history that had been simplified or hidden. 1 year after his press conference, Taehan returned to the same hotel ballroom where the controversy had begun. This time, he was there to accept an award from the Korean Historical Association for his contribution to historical understanding. The room was packed with historians, journalists, and families who had discovered their own hidden heroes through the movement his honesty had started. I learned something important this year, he said during his acceptance speech. The truth is not always comfortable, but it is always more interesting than fiction. Real heroes are not perfect people who never made mistakes. They're ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when they needed it most. In the audience, his sister Ji-yoon wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her brother receive recognition for choosing truth over career safety. Their great-grandfather's photograph, the one that had been hidden in shame for 70 years, now sat in a place of honor in the Korean War Memorial Museum as part of an exhibit about hidden resistance operations. As Taehan left the hotel that night, he walked past the spot where protesters had once gathered to condemn him. Now, there was a small plaque commemorating the place where one person's courage to tell a difficult truth sparked a national conversation about the complexity of heroism. He pulled out his phone and called his grandfather, who was now 92, and had become something of a celebrity himself, as the son of a newly recognized resistance hero. Grandfather Taehyun said, "I think great-grandfather would be proud. His secret is finally safe to tell, and people understand that he was exactly the kind of hero our country needed, smart enough to survive and brave enough to fight, even when nobody could know he was fighting." The old man's voice was weak, but happy when he replied. He always said that someday Korea would be strong enough to handle complicated truths. I think that day finally came. As Taehan walked home through the busy Seoul streets, he realized that losing his career as a romantic drama star had been worth gaining something much more valuable: the knowledge that truth was always worth telling. Sometimes, if you were brave enough to tell it, truth could change not just your own life, but the lives of countless others who had been waiting for permission to stop being ashamed of heroes who had been forced to hide in plain sight.